few words that are from a prepared text about this lecture series. The Shulman lectures are presented under the auspices of the Franke Program in Science and Humanities, an immensely important program for the Humanities Center, which is very generous and helps us to connect outside of the humanities in all sorts of amazing ways. It's made possible by the generosity of Richard and Barbara Franke. This series is named after Robert Shulman, Sterling Professor Emeritus of Chemistry, Molecular Biophysics, and Biochemistry, and Senior Research Scientist in Diagnostic Radiology. I'm not going to embarrass him by forcing you to applaud for him, although he deserves it. We can maybe include him in the applause when the talk is done. He was a founding fellow of the Whitney and an unwavering supporter of the integration of science and humanities, which these lectures really show. I want to thank Gary Tomlinson for inviting me to give this seminar and to invite these marvelous speakers, to Norman Thompson, the US of Humanities, to Mark Bauer, Sandra Mellon Bowles, and to Anna Albert, the graduate assistant, for making all this possible. And I also want to welcome the students, as I always do. These talks go with a seminar, and the students have been absolutely amazing thinking about what it means to report on non-human worlds as if there were worlds, as if there was something called the human, as if we could imagine making reports from them. And we had an incredibly lively discussion today with Claire Colebrook, who's our guest tonight, in which we interrogated her and pushed her, and she was gracious enough to push back in all the right places. I want to mention, before I introduce our speaker, that on November 13th, Manuel de Landa is going to be speaking on philosophical chemistry. This was a talk that was postponed from a previous date because he had the flu, and if the molecules that have affected him in the past don't affect him in the future, he'll be talking about the point of view of molecules. Today I want to introduce Claire Colebrook, who is Edwin Erle Sparks Professor of English at Penn State University, who has held professorships in the University of Edinburgh, at Stirling University, who was a senior lecturer in philosophy and critical theory at Monash University, all incredible credentials for a critical theorist. And to mention only a few of her books, which have the biggest range of anyone, I think, working today. First of all, Irony in the Work of Philosophy from 2003. Milton, Evil and Literary History from 2008. Deleuze and the Meaning of Life from 2010. William Blake and Digital Aesthetics from 2012. We get the idea. What do you call it when it's not a trilogy but a duology of books called Essays on Extinction, the first Death of the Posthuman and Sex, the second Sex After Life, and now a book that she's working on called Fragility, Species, Planet, Archive. There are numerous edited collections, some of which she's done on her own, some of which she's done with other people. I'll mention Deleuze and feminist theory because it's a really important intervention, and extinction because it's something we should be thinking about, and the amount of articles and book chapters make it impossible to mention anything. But I want to thank her for her presentation today, and hopefully you'll have some questions for her about these very timely topics like the end of the world. So thank you for that.
Thanks. Thanks very much for inviting me here. It's a great honor. This talk I'm going to give today, I'm going to try and read it out because I tend to go off script and ramble, so I'm going to read out some written ramble. But I'm very honoured to be here, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the seminar this afternoon, which made me rethink things to the point where I might not believe any of what I'm actually going to read out. What I'm going to do, hopefully, is connect three concepts: art, art, but I'm going to say art, because I can't sustain that for an hour or less even. Art, fragility, and world, and the end of the world. So I guess that's four things. So there are three ways we might think about the end of the world. Literally, the end of the world might be the annihilation of the planet, this world, this earth, or even the annihilation of existence, a catastrophe, of cosmic proportions that brings matter, substance, and not just what has come to be known as life to an end. There is some literature on that sort of catastrophe, the end of the world, the end of the planet, possibly the end of the cosmos and matter. That sense of the world has very little purchase in the booming end of the world media industries. A booming industry, bandwagon, which I just hopped onto. I'm in end of world studies. So in terms of cultural representations of what that might mean, one might think of Lars von Trier's Melancholia as one of the few films to avoid redemptive conclusions and to think of the end of the world as the end of the planet. Maybe there are some other examples out there of, well, maybe Byron's Darkness as a text about annihilation as such, not just... the second sense, which is what I'm going to talk about, one might think of the end of the world rather uncritically as the end of whatever counts as our world. So most apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic culture is dominated by this sense. The world is not human life and not even human social life, but human life that is aware of itself as globally human, aware of all the variants, cultures, spaces and times that make up the human. What do I mean by that? Well, in post-apocalyptic culture, films, but also books, the end of the world is more often than not depicted as a world where humans have lost global reflexiveness. Classic case would be Cormac McCarthy's The Road, where we're left wandering around. We haven't got cameras, we haven't got phones, we haven't got televisions, so we're just humans gathered together wandering around. We've lost the world, by which I mean we've lost a sense of viewing the rest of the world or imagining the rest of the world. It's just us left. It's a world without viewing, a world reduced to immediacy, or, and here's a point I want to make, it's a world without the aesthetic. The aesthetic here is a specific mode of worldly humanity where one is able to regard objects, others, and fragments as signs of another world. So that's how I'm defining the aesthetic. I know it's a problematic, probably a lazy way of using it, but it's how I'm going to use it. That the aesthetic is a capacity to view something as a fragment from another world. It might be worth asking at what point the human became global in this aesthetic sense. At what point did being able to view oneself and others as fragments of an interconnected whole become definitive of who we are? Now, the possibility of thinking otherwise, other than this form of aesthetic humanity, is given over and over again today in post-apocalyptic culture, where we're imagining that what has come to be known as the world, which is this, paintings and fragments from a past, buildings and books that suggest a path, that's all been annihilated and we're left as the mere beings we are. So typically, post-apocalyptic culture represents the end of the world as the end of the aesthetic. That's one of my claims. Typically, the future is at once the end of the world with the typical loss of imagined ease and leisurely freedoms, but it's also a utopian and dystopian diagnosis of the present. The threat of climate change, which is played out over and over again in contemporary culture, mainly cinema but also literature, exposes us to a state of emergency where, whether we're slave-like replicants or not, the fragility of existence will threaten everything that we deem to be human. To take the most recent example, Blade Runner 2049, I don't know how many people have seen it. Yeah, it's a long film. And I'm one of the idiots that didn't go and see it in 3D because I went to the wrong cinema. Blade Runner 2049 imagines the future to be one in which we have been saved by synthetic farming methods, but where that technology of redemption has also enabled corporate control and exposed us to subjection to those that hold the power of living on. I see that as a typical post-apocalyptic motif where the fragility of our own existence enables something like a state of emergency to seize hold of power and then preclude us from being properly human. By being properly human, I mean being capable of the aesthetic, being not subjected to mere life. So the utopian strand of the film, and I don't think this contains any spoilers, but by the looks of when I said who's seen it, I didn't see a lot of enthusiasm, so probably not spoiling it for anyone. Anyway, the utopian strand of the film lies in a revolutionary movement led by some replicants who know about the miracle, and that's the word that's used, of a replicant who gave birth. Somewhere out there, 2 replicants managed to give birth. Even though that's an interesting opportunity for science fiction, the film doesn't... I think you could have had some interesting theories about how 2 replicants managed to replicate. But no, they didn't go there. So what is essentially human, the capacity to generate life, is at once no longer solely human, and yet it's this very capacity of birth and creation that holds the promise to futurity in the film. So the film ends, as post-apocalyptic films often do, including the film of Cormac McCarthy's wrote, with a child who is not the humanity of the present, but who will be the humanity of the future. The moral axiology of the narrative is typically post-apocalyptic in the way in which it parses the relations among humanity, world, fragility, and creativity. So what is always being destroyed, humans are still in existence, but what our exposure to fragility has done is remove any capacity of the aesthetic. There's plenty of simulation, there's plenty of copying, but creativity is what's placed under threat. And significantly, the redemptive child in the film is also the creator of dreams. I guess I just did spoil it. But probably you'll forget that I just said that, almost certainly. So what I'm trying to suggest is there's a narrative arc to post-apocalyptic culture, which is very, very common, in which humanity as it has been has destroyed the world, but humanity as it really is emerges at the end to save the world. And humanity as it really is not corporate world enslaving humanity, but this creative, futural, and what I will call aesthetic humanity comes to save the art will save the day. Right? We're liberated from mere existence. One way of reading the present would be to see where we are as poised on the brink of fragility. That's one way of reading the present. I think it's the way of reading the present, but one way of reading with the present would be to see where we are as poised on the brink of fragility. And we might capture this present by way of the phrase, too big to fail. Humanity is too big to fail. Life in general is a process of coming into being and passing away, emergence and extinction, existence and non-existence. We all know that. Any of us who did grade 1 primary school science know things come into being, they live, they die, right? But to say humanity will just come and go and die, come on, that's not serious. You know, we're too big to fail. We don't just come into being and pass away. What happens if we start to think about the end of all relation to coming into being and passing away? That would seem to amount to the end of the world, and that is unthinkable. The world, in the sense of a global awareness of becoming, is something so encompassing that it simply must be. Its non-being is unthinkable or too big to fail. And so I think one of the performative effects of post-apocalyptic culture, however bleak we feel about humanity, however worthless we might feel about human history, all you have to do is pose a threat to it in a disaster epic, and suddenly there's this, I know humans are bad, but we're not that bad, and you save us at the end in some other redeemed form. So if there was simply existence, simply stuff or matter that did not know itself as matter or did not take up a relation to itself, then that seems clearly not as worthy of life as life that knows itself to be. So life comes into being and passes away, but the wonderful thing about human life, supposedly, is it knows itself to be coming into being and passing away. So zombies, for example, and I know too much is said about zombies, and I'm just going to add to the too many sentences that have been uttered about zombies. But zombies, for example, are the end of the world in so many ways, just simply because they perceive, they live, but they don't know that they perceive or live. So in many ways, we appear to be on the brink of the end of the world. But what makes us too big to fail, such that our end would not be a minor event, but the event, such that the end of our world would be the end of the world, is the way in which we have constructed ourselves around non-failure. So we're too big to fail, not just too big to fail because we're too important, but that our failure would be the end of all narratives of progress, failure and success. So when we talk of human rights, human dignities, basic human conditions and humanity, we do refer to a specific portion of modern, liberal, affluent humanity that established social forms of freedom and autonomy because of manufactured stability. So the creation of a humanity that is too big and too important to fail was the outcome of a long history of manufacturing stability. So we weren't just merely Cormac McCarthy type beings wandering the planet. We were beings with a sense of a world, a sense of futurity, and a sense of a right to be human. Our climate, our world, our sense of self was possible only by way of a series of industries that outsourced fragility. So what came to feel of itself as human, as global humanity, achieved itself by outsourcing fragility. The history of slavery would be but one example of that outsourcing of fragility, where other humans bore the burden of vulnerability and fragility in order for a stable humanity, the outside of which was unthinkable to emerge. The only future we can imagine as desirable is one where the entire globe becomes human just like me, where what we have now is sustained and extended, where stability increasingly wins out over fragility, where recognition trumps chaotic dispersal, non-recognition, and the end of the world. So the end of the world, at least as it's been figured so far, has always been the end of this global human relationality. So I take as my classic image of this, Cormac McCarthy's The Road. It's the end of the world. There are still humans. They may be eating each other, but there are still humans. But what's gone is any form of global humanity or relationality, and certainly any form of art. Here's where I go on to talk about art more specifically. Art and the notion of relationality. In a very unremarkable sense, art is a relational concept. Thinking about anything, of course, requires relations, and there's no concept that isn't bound up with the world, language, and context from which it emerges. Even in the hard sciences, what something really is relies upon the ways in which practices, disciplines, and other properties and tendencies form relations with whatever is in question. To define something is to understand its relations. But to say that thinking, speaking, and theorising something require relations does not necessarily reduce everything to relations. So understanding H2O means understanding its relations and having a relation towards it, but it is also in itself distinct from those relations, maybe. Even if we only know molecules through relations, we can nevertheless think about the molecular level. This might be why we can say that relations are external to terms. Being short, tall, near or far is not within the thing itself, but mapped in relation to what it is, to other things. I think that's obvious. But this is not to say that all we have are relations that generate things. If relations are external, then there are some forces that come into relation. Now, here's my claim. Art has an added dimension of relationality. So it's relationality plus or relationality 2.0 or something. Art has an added dimension of relationality. Just what counts as art depends on context, institutions, cultures, language, taste, and history. The very idea of art as such, a separate domain of objects defined by a certain quality, beauty, spirit, genius, sublimity, affect, is almost certainly not universal. I think that's not a controversial claim, that the notion of art is not a universal concept. The very notion of a culture that has art is not a universal concept. were the cave paintings, epics, madrigals, vases, and necklaces that we now view in galleries thought of, created, or experienced as art? I'm going to say no. Right? I'm going to say that things that we now deem to be art because we separate them, look at them as fragments of a past world, were not seen that way. Certainly things like madrigals, stained glass windows did not have that quality in their creation. This is where, in ways that are distinct, art is in direct relation with the end of the world, the end of our world, and what I will call a specifically transcendental fragility. To be art, something must indicate a world that is not fully present, a world that is not fully ours. So to view something as an art object is to see it as a fragment of another world. So here we can contrast art objects and the world they intimate with everyday objects that are fully within our world. So to take just one example, some instructions arrive with my IKEA sofa. I half read them and fleetingly look at the diagrams and the pieces. I assemble my Agnetta sofa and throw the instructions out with the packaging. In a few years, the sofa has started to deteriorate so badly that it's no longer functional, it's uncomfortable, and the fold-out bed is jammed. So I throw it out. Its life was bound up with its functions. The assembly instructions were both part of its life and part of mine, and my relation to the objects and habits around me. The sofa and its assembly are bound up with what I do, the other objects and beings around me, a culture of domestic leisure, 20th century design, imports, junk, and branding. The instructions are part of the life of the sofa and have no sense or import beyond the life of their fleeting purpose. What would it take to turn that sofa into art? Well, quite a lot, you might say, but one can easily imagine an exhibition of 20th century design where the object is taken out of its world of function, habit, and disposability. That's my argument. Okay. In order to be art, the object must exceed and surpass its own world. Instead of something I throw out, it's something preserved as a sign of another world. So there have been serious challenges to the art world's conception of art, that one I've just outlined, that art is a detached, purposeless object freed from the conditions of emergence. But I want to accept for now that definition because I think it can tell us a lot about the end of the world. My hypothesis is, even though we've all taught students or read essays about how that notion of the detached art object is no longer viable, it's displaced by notions of installation art and 21st century aesthetics, I think it still has an embedded purchase in the attachment to our world. So this is the third part about the end of the world. So we've discussed art, now I'm going on to the end of the world. So there's a current mania for the end of the world, evident in post-apocalyptic cinema, literature and other arts, and also in a series of theoretical and philosophical endeavours, including, and I want to make a lot of this, the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. For those of you who don't know it, there's a Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University that is tasked with, it has a couple of remits. First task is thinking about global catastrophic risk. And the second is an artificial intelligence project. So that the claim would be, the interrelated claim that's embedded in the remit is first that it's catastrophic to lose a lot of humans, right? That's catastrophic to lose a lot of humans. But it's not an existential catastrophe. What an existential catastrophe would be to lose human intelligence. So one of the claims is made that we might think that something, and it is inflammatory, but it's an example that's used, is we might think the Holocaust is absolutely catastrophic, but really, when all's said and done, we do survive. However, losing intelligence, that's a real catastrophe. Now, why I make a lot of this is because there's something about the human, it's called the Future of Humanity Institute, which is defined by not the existence of the number of bodies, but by a capacity to think. And so the artificial intelligence project that is being explored at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University is about saving and developing and arriving at technological maturity of human intelligence. And human intelligence is defined as very narrowly, needless to say. I could talk more about that if you're interested. So it does not take much reflection, I think, to conclude that the end of the world is the end of our world. Right? Disaster scenarios. So from post-apocalyptic culture to rarefied institutes like the Future of Humanity Institute, survival is the survival of a distilled version of what we currently are. So not just as we currently are, because that's not good enough, but the distilled version where we've hived off intelligence and benevolence from the bit that's destroyed us. So disaster scenarios frequently display urban affluence, globally attended by a way of mass media, reduced to the sorts of conditions that most humans have been living in and are still living in, for the sake of this world that is now imagining its end. So we don't need to look at Mad Max Fury Road with its depiction of humanity reduced to resource-depleted hordes, tyrannised by squandering despots, or Elysium, with half the world's population reduced to indentured labour, or Colony, television series, where life is haunted by the constant surveillance undertaken by invading and appropriating colonisers, to conclude that what we imagine as the end of our world is humanity in general experiencing life in the way that the majority of humans already have. So the condition that Cormac McCarthy figures as the end of the world of mere existence is not an exceptional, horrific future, but the way most humans have lived. I say that quite literally, as in most humans have been tied to mere existence. Such that, and such is the limit of our imagination, that any form of existence other than our own is deemed to be the end of the world. Beyond cinema and literature, there's vast amounts of work on sustainability in the future that assumes that saving the planet requires saving our world. Recycling, buying local, driving a smaller car less often, purchasing carbon offsets, or having fewer children may or may not be noble endeavours, but they all serve to sustain the notion that there is our world and that it must be saved. Indeed, without the idea that this world may fall back into fragility, there would not be and could not be the demand for its continuity. So I see post-apocalyptic culture as having this ongoing performative function of playing out our ends such that we demand our future. So, nothing is more capable of silencing the question of whether and how we ought to live than the continually replayed possibility that we may not live. And this continually replayed scenario of our non-being is not an affirmation of the possibility of our end, so much as continuous insistence that we must not end. The cogito of the 21st century is not, I think, therefore I am, but rather, I am threatened with non-existence, therefore I must continue to be. This is because non-existence or the non-relational is not admissible in our world. And this is because we are the world. We are finally that moment in human and life history that recognises itself as one humanity in variation. To lose a tribe or a people is lamentable, but to lose humanity is catastrophic. So here I would refer to, there's a very mournful Australian documentary called The Last Tasmanian Aborigine, which is very problematic for so many reasons, where there's a mournful attitude to lost tribes, right? It's mournful. But it doesn't have the catastrophic import of losing humanity. The implication being to lose our tribe or our people is different from losing humanity, because losing humanity is losing us. There is more than parochialism at work here. It's not just that from within any world it would be natural to want one's own world to continue. In fact, I don't think there's anything at all natural in the sense of inevitable about the world, and certainly not about the end of the world. So the world that has the end of the world built into it is this world that has this very unique sense of the aesthetic. The only world that could be obsessed with the end of the world is the world that also harbours the art world, a world where I can view an object as a fragment from a world that I can read and view. What sort of world can take an object from another world, set it apart in a gallery, and view it with wonder? What sort of world can have industries devoted to the mass production of copies, where it's possible to view and own for oneself an object that one values from afar? What sort of world teaches global literatures? It's a world that is so bound up with a very specific sense of the world that it relies upon other worlds and therefore cannot imagine anything other than itself. Consider the scenarios through which we imagine the end of the world, ranging from the classic scene in The Planet of the Apes, where Charlton Heston, the first Planet of the Apes, Charlton Heston views a Statue of Liberty that is reduced to so much junk, to the Book of Eli, where there's one remaining copy of the Bible, but unfortunately it's in Braille, to Oblivion, where Tom Cruise holds onto an LP of Whiter Shade of Pale, to Emily St. John Mantle's Station 11, where a wandering troupe continue to perform Shakespeare, and to travel to the Museum of Humanity that once was. These scenes, I want to argue, aren't simply dystopias. They are displacements of things we hold dear, the Statue of Liberty, Shakespeare, a Whiter Shade of Pale, if we do hold that dear. They're displacements of things we hold dear to a world in which they may no longer be recognised as having any value or sense, right? So it's this horrific image that there's a Bible, but it's in Braille and no one wants to read it or can read it. So that's the end of the world. When the philosopher Martin Heidegger said animals were poor in world, he did not deprive them of a world, but set them apart in their poverty. Animals have habits, expectations, memories, and even basic forms of sociality. What they don't have is a capacity for the end of the world, or a capacity for angst, to experience their world as our world, as though all the rhythms and manners that composed its existence might be otherwise. Humans not only have a world, but in their capacity to be bored or anxious, can experience their own world as if it were no longer. So for Heidegger, one of the ways this worlding of the world could be experienced was through art and through thinking. In the Age of the World picture, Heidegger makes a contrast between the managerialism of the present, everyone with their own expertise and range of things, and thinking, where any world of things intimates other worlds. So I'm using this concept of Heidegger's critically, right? I'm saying that he has this so if the animal is poor in world, then it's good to be rich in world, or to be human is to be Dasein is to be rich in world. Such a world blessed with a sense of itself because of other worlds, is always implicitly the art world. This is to say that the art world is bound up with a self-defining project of humanity that is both colonising and productive of a form of leisured viewing that requires many other labouring and appropriated worlds. More importantly, the world that now plays its own impossible end over and over again is coterminous with an art world attitude. So for all its low culture takeover, post-apocalyptic culture, even films like The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Day After Tomorrow, they're actually obsessed with a really traditional notion of art. That is, without these things that we hold and value and observe from afar, it might as well be the end of the world. In a standard post-apocalyptic narrative, something designated as humanity is threatened, and we know just what this humanity is because of what would remain, mere life, right? So there's always this war in post-apocalyptic culture between humans as they are, with their cultural paraphernalia, and humans as they must not be, humans reduced to mere life. One more example. Chris Nolan's Interstellar, for all its complexity, pits a benighted humanity blessed with imagination and futurity against a merely survivalist bureaucracy. So Interstellar has a managerial human world in which mere survival is the only value, and the hero of the film is Matthew McConaughey, who's an astronaut, right, who risks his life in order to, once more embrace frontier spirit. And he represents sort of imagination and futurity. So the central character, an astronaut, must travel frontier spirit style to save us all. And it's only by being presented as the possible sufferer of loss that the narrative impulse allows this fighting and colonising humanity to be the only humanity of the future. Now, not all post-apocalyptic dramas are interstellar and are often more allegorical about the logic of colonisation. That is at the same time a logic of art. So, put more succinctly, all post-apocalyptic films are also films about colonisation. It's about a portion of humanity seizing hold of the future. A portion of humanity that's at once destroyed the world but deems itself to be the only humanity that can save the world. So let's imagine the media-rich, affluent, stable and urban world of Manhattan about to be wiped out by a virus, climate catastrophe or invasion. Sometimes the threat is humanity itself in the form of terrorism or planet-destroying capitalism, but it's precisely by way of posing itself as threatened that one can then proceed with a necessary logic of redemption. The more exposed, fragile, vulnerable and damaged this future is imagined to be, the more forceful the heroic narrative of salvation. One might just say that this is one world, urban, Western, capitalist, global, contemplating and averting its own end. One might see this in Freudian terms, not only that one plays out trauma in advance as a form of mastery, but also as a reaction formation, where the more fragile we are, the more we insist that we will and must survive. All that may be going on, but I want to argue that there's more at play. The way we value this world that has a sense of other worlds is telling. If humans were nothing more than existing here and now, no longer blessed with libraries and an industry of the humanities that can purvey and convey other worlds, they would not be truly human. So I'm speaking as it were here. There's a normative definition of the human that has been tied to unthinkability. If there's no libraries, there's no archive, then there's no world. To be human is to be rich in world, and to be rich in world requires conceptually, materially, geopolitically and existentially other worlds. So the end of the world is the end of the human being who's always been able to view and trade in other worlds. So there's a logic of fragility at the heart of the object that is also at the heart of the art world that tells us a lot about the end of the world. In order for a work to be read, viewed, sold, circulated and saved, it must take on a material form, right? In order for an artwork to survive, it has to be given into some form of body or matter. We can't read something into the future unless it survives even in digital form. It must therefore be detached from its first world, if it ever had one. So what allows the artwork to survive is a materiality that also exposes it to fragility. In order for something to survive, it has to take on a form, but if it takes on that form, it's also exposed to fragility. This doesn't change with digital art. On the contrary, one can imagine a future in which, because of digital technologies, Shakespeare and Goethe still exist, but that very material continuity does not secure survival. So the 2 points I'd want to make in relation to this is the more that we store works, right, the more we have the tendency not to read them. This is supposedly the problem of the internet, right? The more knowledge you have online, the less you actually want to secure it or keep it in an archive. But I also want to make a claim about the distinct relationship between art, science and materiality. See if anyone will harangue me about this. But once it's a genre claim, once a scientific or mathematical truth is articulated, it can survive the destruction of its origin, right? The history of mathematics might be interesting, but we don't need to know it in order to be mathematicians. We don't need those original texts. We might want to be able to go back to the original proofs and so on, but the actual sense can be detached from its material origin. I think it's safe to say that if all the copies of Shakespeare were wiped out, but I could still tell you the story of Hamlet, that we wouldn't say Shakespeare had survived. Oh, it's okay, I can give you a catch up. I know the story, I know the plot, right? There's something, that's that spectrum between like keeping the original engravings of Blake's poetry to the pure theorems of logic. Obviously, there's a threshold of indifference there, but it's that logic of art that the artwork survives because it's attached to a materiality which also exposes it to decay. But that very material continuity doesn't secure survival, so a lot of post-apocalyptic works show the Statue of Liberty, but no one recognises it's the Statue of Liberty, right? That's the horror that the world exists, but no one knows it's the world. This is my last paragraph, just in case you're flagging. So works, one of the possibilities of the end of the world is that works could exist as so much waste and rubble. So I take as iconic that scene from Planet of the Apes where the Statue of Liberty exists, but no one knows it's the Statue of Liberty, right? That's the end of the world. The world exists, humans exist, but they don't know they're human anymore, right? There's no art, there's no globalism, there's no screens, there's no reading, there's no communication. There's no relationality in any rich sense. We're living from moment to moment, mouthful to mouthful. So works could exist as so much waste and rubble. They are art only in being given a form beyond their world, so that's what makes them art, that they can be detached from their world. But they can only be sustained as art by intimating a world, right? The Statue of Liberty that's strewn on the beach in the Planet of, is that art? You know, the whole point about Duchamp, isn't it, is that art becomes what it is in being detached and viewed. This odd play of the art industry, art history, and art criticism relied upon thinking of things as bound up with worlds, and a world that is capable of reading and appreciating these worlds. In this sense, imagining a world without art is imagining the end of the world. That's my claim about post-apocalyptic culture, that the end of the world is the end of the aesthetic, the end of art. Only a world that has a sense of its specific end can also demand that it must not end. It's too big to fail. Cultures, tribes, languages and worlds, they can all come and go. But the world that has a sense of those cultures, tribes, languages, that's too big to fail. We can lose a tribe, but we can't lose the sense of the world that views those tribes. Only a world that can look on other worlds as worldless can regard itself as the world. So only a world that can read Cormac McCarthy's The Road as the end of the world, that's the world, right? The world in Cormac McCarthy's The Road is just our world, or the end of the world. Only a world that manufactured art and the humanities by stabilising its means of existence and stabilising its modes of existence through the arts could generate a concept of humanity so global and completing that it produces the impossibility of the outside by constantly imagining the outside. It produces the impossibility of its own outside by constantly imagining the outside. Humanity, in this sense, is too big to fail. Thank you.
You'll take some questions. I'll let you moderate.
Oh, okay.
For yourself if you like, or I can moderate.
No, that's
It's up to
fine.
you.
I'm prepared to moderate if a fight breaks out. Yeah?
If the fight breaks out.
Is it to moderate? Yeah? Yeah?
I'm trying to formulate this into a good, coherent question. But
That's always the
Right.
first, so I thank you for, yeah.
the question that I have is when I think of post-apocalyptic literature or films, there's art often is a living creation, and the human being is God, but also the creator. So in the first Blade Runner, there's the replicants looking to meet God. In the second one, they're slightly different, but they've been brought back, and they are kind of works of art that slave labor.
Yes.
And then Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake, Crake makes this, he blows up the world, but he also creates this group of beings that are his work of art, that his legacy, that live on. How does that fit into this fragmented? Because it comes over and over and over again, these kind of...
I'm going to refer to Year of the Flood, just to... and I think if I had to do what literary critics do and then get my theory and say, look, here's a writer that's saying what I'm saying, I would choose Margaret Atwood, because I think there's an ongoing critique in her work of the creation of something that must endure, right? That has the blueprint, the expression and blueprint of the self, right, that must survive. And to give you a concrete example from Year of the Flood, the narrator, I think it's Wren, refers to her friend Amanda, who's an artist, who creates, draws honey on the floor, and then ants. I mean, this is not, clearly I haven't memorised the text, right?
It's skeletons and things.
And the work comes and goes and it decays, right? So there's this notion, and I think it's tied to Atwood's theory. I mean, everything I've read seems to suggest that I'm misreading it, but this is how I read her, that she's got this notion of, instead of a form of biological kinship that wants to endure, and instead of a form of art practice or biopolitics, because that whole trilogy is about like managing life, securing life, owning life, which is why I read the Adamic, eco people. I read that as completely ironic, that they're just as controlling of life, right, and its continuity. And then she has these fleeting moments of female characters who don't reproduce biologically, but they make friendships, right? So it's a bit Donna Haraway-ish, make, what is it, kith, not kin? I better not get that the wrong way around. And there's this notion of a creativity that would be fleeting, right? And it's a sort, but when you think about it, that's what I meant by, like, when we take objects, right, and they must endure, right, and that they have this lineage attached to them. So we could get into a long discussion about what's going on with, like, Blade, but it's the Blade Runner, but it is about the securing of replication, right?
It's more about living works of art.
Well, and that's it. So I think that I've been writing a lot about living works of art because I'm interested in Milton, right? The poet. My dog's also called Milton, so I always feel I have to, just because that doesn't mean it. But when I say Milton, I'm talking about the poet. And in Areopagitica, he says, well, it's actually more murderous to murder an individual than murder a book, because when you murder a book, you kill something that will live on, right? Now that's interesting because there's this notion that the artwork, and I think it's not just in Milton, but it's all through Milton when he writes on Shakespeare. Sister Shakespeare, we don't really need copies of Shakespeare because your words are eternal. That's right. So I think there is this notion that you want the work of art to be alive, like hyper alive, because then you have this notion of humanity as not what will decay when these things decay, right? You want this, humanity has to be bigger than all the books it creates, right? It's a paradoxical logic, and I think Blade Runner, I'm not a Blade Runner, I know there are Blade Runner scholars, but it's playing out with that notion of you want it to be alive and survive and endure, but not that alive, right? not so alive that it starts to take over, and that's the problem also people like Milton have with books, right? They want freedom of the press, they want circulation, but Milton also believes, but if you do that enough, ultimately truth will, right? Because it's a life, it's always a proper life, right? I think Milton hadn't read any Baudrillard. He didn't think that the copy of the book that he was going to save was going to mutate into something. Yeah, so I think we want it to be alive, right? But not, but a certain organic life in a well-bounded form, not a viral form of life, yeah.
I have a question about your attitude towards fragility.
Yes.
I can't figure out.
Oh,
Because
okay.
it seems to have the seed of this dialectic of destruction in it.
Yeah.
If you say we're fragile, then you say we could be destroyed, then you look for props. And so are you saying that we should live in fragility, or we should get rid of that discourse altogether?
I think that bit of my ideas, to speak self-importantly, is really quite simple, which is there's been a history of a portion of humanity stabilising itself by outsourcing fragility. That's, I think, uncontroversial, right? So particularly if you, like white Australian, you live in a desert landscape, right? And you've imported European culture there, right? Massively destructive for other humans, right? Then when that culture, when that world begins to decay, right, you've made this absolutely robust, stable world, right, where you think I'm not a climate change denier, right, but you've stabilised the climate. So our notion of climate is actually manufactured. We stabilised it. And we stabilised it by either outsourcing instability, right, or what do you call it when you bet on it? Hedge it into the future, right? You've deferred your instability, right? So the reason why things are volatile now is because we've had stability. And then we imagine that fragility, right, the state of emergency, is an interruption to what is properly human. And I want to reverse that. And I want to say that what we've taken to be properly human, stable, right, is actually always occurred by the things that we are now fearing being manufactured elsewhere. So my take on fragility is because we're so married to robust invulnerability. That's why I use the phrase too big to fail. One can't imagine a human life other than ours as anything other than the end of the world, right? So, yes. Does that maybe make it clear? Yes. Read the book. Yeah. Out by Christmas. Yeah. Big stocking filler. Yeah, go on.
I have a question about zombies. Ever since the advent of like fast zombies, right? Zombies that can run.
Yes.
I've seen a lot of zombie fiction.
Right.
And I think there's something like especially unnerving about, zombieism, like actual zombies or metaphorical ones, that doesn't just have to do with the annihilation of like forms of relationality and capacity to be self-reflexive, etc. It seems like there's something especially freaky about zombies because there are a great deal of qualities that persist, right?
Yes.
And I was just wondering, if you could just speak more to, I guess, the special charge of like these forms of uncanniness. Right.
As I find the zombie problem a very simple and unfascinating one, and there's a long sort of philosophical debate in Australian analytic philosophy, right, about, and it doesn't so much use the zombie, but if I'm having all the perceptions, movements, actions that would count as personhood, right, but I don't have the interiority, am I a person? So, and then, that creates. Now, it seems to me the very fact that we have that as a problem, right, if I look like a person, touch like a person, talk like a person, seem to act like a person, but I'm not, that shows we've got a long history of manufacturing interiority, right? That guarantees and sets apart a type of experience, right? That, I mean, in the seminar we had this afternoon, this is the sort of other end of the spectrum. The amount of literature I've read that celebrates, for example, Buddhism, right? Mindfulness, because instead of me monitoring, I've got to win this tennis match because if I don't win this tennis match, then I'll lose prestige. If I lose prestige, instead of that, this whole notion of just being in the moment, being present, right? If you look at that naive literature on Buddhism, it's actually a sort of valorization of what we imagine zombies to be, right? A pure presentness that doesn't want to, and if there are any Buddhists in the room, I'm not calling you zombies. Or if there are any zombies in the room, I'm not attributing a religion to you that you may not want to buy into. But what I'm saying is there's this sort of thought experiment of mindlessness, right? The horror is the zombie and the lure is the infant or the animal or the Buddhist, right? And so but getting back to, you're right, there's now these zombies are chasing you, the running app that you can do. Yeah, I just think that the reason why it's got like a lot of recent purchase is because there's there's all these things about zombie capitalism, but we are dealing with, we're here, we're alive, we're humans, but what we've known and valued as human is up for grabs, right? So if we look at the new forms of attention and reading and spectatorship that we're embarking on, those old forms of memory, cognition and archive, right? They're no longer prima facie valuable, right? I think we here in this room, right, would be horrified at a world in which there wasn't books and reading. But I think there's many humans who don't feel the horror of that. And so I think, zombieism is, I'm not saying that people that don't read are zombies, right? But I am saying that we'll often look at people who don't read as right? They might as well be zombies. So that's where I see zombie mania coming from, a sort of fascination with like being mindless, right? Mere life, mere existence. Cormac McCarthy's The Road, they're not zombies, right? But they're as Deleuze would say, becoming zombie, right? They're on their way, right? To lose your humanity is to lose that sense of that richer sense of temporality and futurity. Yes.
I was just thinking about the nature of the discourse we're having right now.
Yeah.
Which is that we are not in the world of the end of the world. We are looking from the outside at that world.
Yes.
Because if we were in that world, we would be spending our time talking about what the hell to do about it.
Yes.
And responding and reacting and talking about solutions. And, so we're sort of like the passengers on the Titanic who can't imagine that their ship could be hit by a...
Yes. Can't imagine and yet is continually imagining.
Right.
Right. So that's why I actually think the end of the world films and literature, a lot of them aren't really about the end of the world, right? They use things like, so take Blade Runner, or they use climate change as the narrative preface, right? The reason why we got to this stage is some corporation managed to synthesize life, right? Managed to synthesize farming methods, right? So it's there as a preface. It's not about the end of the world that we really are facing, right? It's about the end of this, let's call it Western, affluent, liberal, readerly world, right? And I think, then you could diagnose and say that, well, why are we panicking about that when we really should be panicking about the Maldives sinking or Miami sinking, right? But it's what, I think then there's this sort of parochial attachment. that's why I say we're happy to lose a tribe. And when I say that, I don't mean I'm happy to, but we do see people and we lament it, right? But that doesn't have the sort of existential catastrophe. And what we're not worried about losing the human species, right? Because Cormac McCarthy's right, it's still got. But so I think that you're right, we're not, if we really were in the end of the world, we wouldn't be looking at the Statue of Liberty and crying, right? We'd be looking at the planet and, suffering humans and crying. So I think that I guess, one of my shorter claims is that all that end of the world literature is actually, disclosive of what matters or what we've inscribed to matter to us, and it's not human life. Right? And for good or for ill, like I'm attached to the archive, right?
Yeah. It's not Puerto Rico.
It's so not Puerto Rico, right? It's the archive, and that's why, to see the end of the world as the end of Manhattan is spectacular. But it's more than that, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I hope you'll forgive me for a slightly long-winded question since your talk was so rich.
Or long-winded.
No, very rich. I was wondering if you might tie together 2 points in your talk. The first was this idea of losing our connection with art.
Yeah.
Perhaps the sort of loss of the mimetic value and our inability to see ourselves as relating to a past or present through that. A good example also to add to the list is equilibrium. One takes a pill and suddenly we lose the sense of value for art objects in literature. But I was wondering if you could tie that to the point you made about this aimless wandering without a sense of purpose, because a lot of from the road to in which, for example, when they get to the sea, there isn't an understanding, for example, of the Odyssean sense, like you need to cross the sea to return home.
Yeah.
I was wondering if that sort of art object, that connection, sort of has a kind of nostos, a sort of return home to who we are as humans, given that in other examples too, like Battlestar Galactica, right? Admiral, at the time he was, I guess, Commander Adama has to sort of create this false nostos as a way of giving purpose to an otherwise meaningless sort of existence.
Yeah, you would have to say it has a notion of the art object signifying a lost past world, right? That's how it functions. Again, in Blade Runner, right? There's a little wooden horse that signifies paradise lost, right? And then you have to make the good old Miltonic maneuver that is without a sense of a lost world, right? We don't have who we are. And that's not just Miltonic, that's every disaster epic has to have these bad humans took over, right? The capitalists, the Americans, it has to be some accident that occurred that allowed evil, neoliberal, bio-corporate humanity to take over. But the real humanity is there, because otherwise we can't say, oh, we just want to save the way we are now. That's not going to fly, right? We've messed up the planet. We can't say humanity has a prima facie right to survive. What we can do is have, by way of the lost object, right, the proper humanity that was somehow displaced or pushed away by Satan or capitalism, right? And that lost object is a sign of our proper potentiality. That's as true of Battlestar Galactica as it is of Agamben. Or Bernard Stiegler, right, whose work I'm editing right now, has, that archive. Without that archive, we're nothing, right? So does that connect the two?
I think so.
Yeah, I hope so. Yes?
I think it's drone operators that are major consumers of mindfulness training. So it's not just zombies, it's soldiers.
Right.
And
I didn't know.
I'm thinking there's a very nice passage in Walter Benjamin's essay on the storyteller, which he talks about Herodotus, you probably know this, in which grief is triggered by arbitrary objects, just because it's so difficult to empathize with such catastrophic things. So empathy with the inorganic is easier than empathy with humans. Empathy with animals.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that's part of it.
Huh. Yeah, because I think if we go back to what we want to save, I think this is an answer. What we want to save, even in these very parochial, gung-ho, pro-Manhattan, right, what we want to save is never what we are. Right? It's never, it's this lost enigmatic humanity that was somehow given in the form of the child.
Humanities are non-human.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think that it's always more catastrophic. I mean, that's where one of the questions that came up in the seminar we did this afternoon was like the art. Why is there no art about the loss of 9/11? And I think there is, because on the one hand, 9/11 had this odd category. We do have these disasters like the mass shooting yesterday, and we feel mournful about them, but they don't have that catastrophic, grief-stricken sense of this imagined lost world. And I think the interesting thing about 9/11, it was both. It was both an actual loss of life, but was also a symbolic, theatrical. That was the genius, if you like, of the terrorism behind it, right? That it wasn't just killing a lot of people, but killing something more than that. So I think that interesting thing, there's a quote, not so good as Walter Benjamin, but where Hume says it's not contrary to reason to avoid a scratch on my little finger over the destruction of humanity, right? And he's making this claim about the poverty of reason, right? But I think he's onto something more about the problem of empathy, right? And immediacy, and something as abstract as losing humanity doesn't have that fragmentary attachment that we would have to partial objects, yeah. So I'd go from Benjamin to Hume, get things out of Germany and into Scotland, I think is always my theoretical tactic. Yes?
How about looking at this project a little bit cynically and saying that maybe to think the very concept of an end of the world is just a human universal in a way, that at some point it might have been, the second coming of Christ. Now it might be, the death of art or climate change, or this fear of eternity, the fear that stuff might just be going on.
Right.
So this human creation of some boundary point where we just, say eternity comes after that, as a way of not having to engage with the possibility of just complete open-endedness.
Yeah.
So that what we're experiencing now is just another form of our figment of our minds, of creating, this end of something.
Sure, I think I know I disagree with that because I used to think it, right? And I had a grad student. So this is where it started. So the things that made me dislodge me from what I was interested in was originally it's called post-apocalyptic culture, right? And I'm not so myopic to think that it began in the 21st century because it says post-apocalyptic, right? And apocalypse gives you an indication. And, I spent a lot of time reading Blake, who's, imagining ends of worlds and so forth. But then this is why I want to make a difference between the end of the world and the end of the world, right? So that what you see, and it came from a graduate student who was a medievalist, and the thing is, because I'm Australian, I've not read any medieval literature, and I know what medievalists do is no matter what you're talking about, they've read something that's like 20 steps ahead of it, and you can't go back and read it because you're not a medievalist, so you have to take their word for it. But my grad student said, well, and this made sense to me. All the time these people were living with a sense of, we might all be wiped out tomorrow, right? It wasn't the end of the world, right? A plague might just wipe us out. And then another friend of mine who was working on Indigenous Australian narratives, they all had narratives of, there were these people that existed and they don't exist anymore, right? And we might not exist, right? But what I want to draw an essential distinction is between what you're saying, which is, yeah, there's often been narratives or thoughts of non-existence, right? The apocalyptic tradition in Christian and beyond Christian thinking. And then this very, very fetishized sense of the end of the world, which isn't as imaginative as Blake, right? Where you get a huge conflagration and some, spectacular revelation that's not a revelation. Instead, you get people wandering around Manhattan that don't have television anymore, right? So that if you look at, and I always get the names of the two, not the day the Earth stood, the day after tomorrow, right, which is the end of the world, set in the New York Public Library. I think that's, it's not, so the day the Earth stood still is the one with Keanu Reeves as the alien. And that's, the end of the world isn't this, what you're suggesting, humans and their capacity to have these metaphysical imaginings about non-being. I'm with you there, right? This is the opposite of that. This is not, the industry we're in now is actually incapable of imagining what might it be not to be, right? Instead, it's what might it be to live like a lot of humans already live, right? I think I'm really interested in Cormac McCarthy, like Margaret Atwood, right? Because I think they're both onto the fact that the end of the world already exists. It's just out, we've just pushed it to Mexico. For Cormac McCarthy, it's Mexico, right? And I think his Mexico is not Mexico, but Mexico, right? This invented place where that's already the road, right? You're not convinced.
Well, I mean, one of the other projects of the Oxford is that I heard from someone that they've calculated that we have to start flying at light speed within the next 5 billion years to be able to reach the end of the universe because
Correct.
it's going to start expanding faster.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we have a certain view of the world right now, and our world, maybe it's planet Earth. But these other cultures that had different ideas of what the end of the world would be, they had a different end of the world. I mean, their world might be their family, and that might be the entire world, which to us is so who says that our world might not in the future be the end of the galaxy, and that being the...
I'm with you. I'm with you 100% on that. My claim is that the sorts of thoughts, experiments that you're entertaining there, right? I think, and I want to make this quite concrete about the politics of sustainability and climate change and the environment. We imagine, right, that either we keep going in some modified version of what we have now or nothing, right? And what I think needs to be done is not look at, let's go back to Cormac McCarthy, not look at Mexico as the end of the world, right? Not look at lives that are other than ours as, well, it might as well be the end of the world, right? That I think there needs to be more of the sort of imaginative leap, right? With this, what other forms of human existence are imaginable? And we don't just say, well, it might as well be the end of the world, right? If there's no TV, I mean, that's a lot of this post-apocalyptic culture is a world that's just no longer urban, affluent Manhattan, right? And I think there might be other forms of existence that are viable. Maybe.
From our particular position, not quite in Manhattan. We'll thank Professor Colebrook.
Thank you.